Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Paraboss webinar. Today we're going to talk all things dung beetles, and little did we realise that they are some of our livestock on our farm. We need to think a little bit about their stocking rates and what their implications and impacts on our own farms, particularly with a slant on what we're doing with regards to our parasites, managing our parasites, and how these little guys can help us out. Today we're joined by Russ Barrow and Dr. Russ Barrow and Paul Meibusch, and these guys are fascinatingly passionate about all things dung beetles.
So a quick introduction to myself and Russ. We come from a company called Eco Insects. My journey with dung beetles began a lot further back in the 80s and 90s, growing up on a farm and remembering when dung beetles arrived and what sort of impact that had on the fly population. But then starting off in managing the Ecosystems Engineers program, I had some assumptions that many of you probably have now, is that that once dung beetles are introduced to your farm, that they just get on and they spread and they manage themselves and they're there forever. I assumed that. I assumed that most dung beetles were pretty much the same, and there was probably a couple of different species, but they all did the same thing. And as long as there was a bit of pasture clearing and the dung was being processed or at least disappearing in some way, then I was pretty happy.
So let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that's dung production. Now, if you go to various websites, they'll almost certainly tell you that the number of tons that stock produced per year is 80 million. I suppose they're not wrong, but they're vastly underestimating how much dung is produced. So if we just take the cattle herd and the sheep flock in Australia, 68 million sheep, these are 2021 numbers, 26 million cattle, and multiply those numbers up by the average amount of dung produced per day, you can skip down to the bottom and see that cattle, and these are just beef cattle, they don't include the dairy herd, are producing 237 million tonnes per year, and the sheep an additional 49.6, close to 50 million tonnes per year. So we've got a dung problem, and that's why the Australian dung beetle project started back in the late 60s, in part to address the issue of dung fouling pastures, being breeding grounds for flies and other pest species such as nematodes. More recently, we've worked with the Dung Beetle Ecosystem Engineers project. It was run out of Charles Sturt University and involved University of Western Australia, New England, and CSIRO. And we continue to do that for at least the next couple of months. So very briefly, what are the benefits of dung beetles? The one that I'm going to focus on today is the one shown in red. Basically, they provide valuable ecosystem services, and the one that we'll be focusing on is their capacity to aid in pest and parasite suppression. They do this by interrupting life cycles, whether it's the fly life cycle or the nematode life cycle. The two pictures there are showing you buffalo fly. Limited success with it, unfortunately, because of the rapidity at which the buffalo fly life cycle progresses. Much more success in the control of various nematodes through the use of dung beetles. They also increase soil porosity. They increase aeration of the soil and water infiltration. They reduce runoff, washing dung into waterways and polluting those waterways. And of course, they have a very good impact on nutrient cycling, where dung is taken down and the nutrients that go with it and micronutrients in the soil are brought up as the tunneling of the dung beetles takes place. So the dung's got a very good nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium ratio, almost exactly what you want for a growing plant. What we've got here are the life cycles of a fly. Now, it's not the buffalo fly or the bush fly, which are the two common species that we try to interrupt the life cycle of. I've just combined them together. So what we can focus on here is the fly lays an egg in the dung. It hatches into a larvae in the maggot, and that goes through several larval stages. You can see the egg takes up to a day to hatch, and the larvae can take 4 to 7 days, depending on the temperature and depending on the species, before it becomes a pupa and eventually emerges as the adult fly, and the life cycle continues. If we're talking about cattle, sheep, goats, horses, they're all subject to gastrointestinal nematodes, and these eggs are excreted in the dung. As the eggs hatch, you go through several juvenile or larval stages of the nematode, and the first 2 stages are resident in the dung pat or the dung pellets, and it's only as the nematode progresses to the 3rd larval stage that it then wriggles away from the dung mass, usually goes up a piece of grass, which is then ingested by the sheep, cattle, horses, or goats, and the reinfection process continues. So where are we heading with the life cycles? Well, anything we can do to the dung mass where the eggs, the juvenile stages, or the larvae are present, if we can interrupt that dung mass within the first few days before progression to a pupa for a fly, or before progression to the 3rd larval stage as a nematode, then you've got the capacity to suppress, sometimes absolutely, but more generally suppress the levels of parasites or pests reinfecting and continuing the life cycle. We know that we've reduced bush flies by 95 to 100%. Up in the north, where buffalo flies are a problem, we haven't been as successful, and that's mainly based on the dung beetle density. So the density of the dung beetles aren't present at the time when the buffalo flies are breeding, and that's unfortunate because it's unfortunate because we don't have the correct species in Australia to cover all those seasons, and we'll touch upon that again later on. So the question is, do I have beetles? We've already seen some of the poll questions come back, and people are saying, yes, I've got beetles, I don't know what they are, or look, I don't know if I've got beetles. So the easiest way for you to determine both whether you have beetles and, once you determine that, what they are, is to go out to a dung pat. Here's Rob posing in front of a nice pat, and he's simply going to scoop that up with a little bit of the soil from underneath and drop it into a bucket. Provided you've got a bucket and a shovel or a trowel, scoop the dung up, pop it into your bucket, then pour some water in. It's as easy as that. This is called a flotation method. You pour the water in. You don't even have to stir it. Stirring it just makes a big mess, but we find that 95% of the beetles come to the surface within a couple of minutes. So pour your water in, wait for the beetles to surface, and you can see on the photograph embedded on the right-hand side there, the beetles are just picked out, thrown into a clean water supply, so you can identify what they are. We recommend this as the most effective, easiest way for you to go out on your farm and see what's in the dung pats or in the dung pellets if you've got sheep. So you've gone and you've done your flotation. Then, of course, a lot of you are saying, well, I've got beetles, but what beetles do I have? And what we've got through the Dung Beetle Ecosystem Engineers project, and there's a website at the bottom of the photograph on the right-hand side, which is www.dungbeetles.com.au. Make sure you put the plural in or you'll go to a different website. Then on there are resources that will allow you to see the photographs, high-resolution photographs with circles and arrows pointing to diagnostic characteristic features of each of the beetles. Some of them, such as the one in front of us now, which is Ornithophagus nigroventris, it's unmistakable. It's commonly called amongst us the jousting beetle because of the long horn protruding from its head. A very impressive beetle and very easy to identify. They aren't all easy to identify, and so we often ask, we run a free identification service, we'll ask you, if you're going to send the beetle in, where is it from? If we've got the beetle, we don't need to know how big it is, but many people send us photographs. And if it's in somebody's hand, we can't always tell how big it is. So if you can tell us that it's 20 millimeters or 15 millimeters or 10 millimeters, that also gives us some good information to go on. what color is it, and any distinguishing features. So this depends on whether you're taking photographs, talking to us, or indeed you can send the beetles in to us. But in the first instance, go to the dungbeetles.com.au website and have a look at the resources that are available to help you identify the beetles yourself. We supply this diagram as an A4 sheet. We can laminate them and supply them laminated. And what we like is we would get the producers to do the flotations monthly, preferably monthly, so we know what's going on throughout the course of a calendar year. And then as you discover different species, we'd really like it if you take your sheet appearing in front of you and pin the beetles to the sheet. And that way, if they occur in December or January or July, we'll know that that beetle was found in that particular season, or indeed in that particular month, depending on where you pinned it. You can use the space on the left and the right-hand side to write down some notes, such as the exact date that that beetle was collected on. Just use a whiteboard marker or a permanent marker and annotate what you've got there. When we come along and we do field days and workshops, if you bring these along, have it attached to a polystyrene board, then this is fantastic for us to understand what's going on across a season in each area. And you'd be stunned how much it can differ from, one valley to the next. We do see very big differences in dung beetle diversity and indeed abundance as we travel across short distances throughout the countryside. So these are available from us and you can contact us to get those. So let's bring up what the life cycle of a dung beetle is. And this is important for what I'm about to say. So let's start with the egg. It's the old question, what comes first, the dung beetle or the egg? We're going to start with the egg, and the egg is laid into a dung mass, which is under the ground. It hatches into a first stage larva. It progresses, much as you saw the fly, through a second larval stage and a third larval stage before it undergoes pupation and eventually emerges as an adult. Now, I've put a typical period up there of 12 months. Some are shorter, some are longer. It's just a guide as to an indication as to how long the life cycle could be. The photograph on the right-hand side is showing you the third larval stage. You can see they just look like a scarab beetle larvae. That's because the vast majority of dung beetles are indeed scarab beetles. So what we've got is a larvae which is encased in a dung mass. If you go out to your lawn and dig the lawn up, you might find scarab larvae, and they're lawn beetles. They won't be in a dung mass. Dung beetles larvae will always be encased in the dung mass because that beetle is eating the dung and not doing any damage to any pasture or any other foliage. It's just eating the dung. So hopefully you've gone out to your paddock, done your flotation, and you've got a lot of beetles. But what if you don't? And we get this frequently. People will say, well, why don't I have beetles? Or more likely, why don't I have many different types of beetles? And there's 4 reasons. We break them down into flood, drought, veterinary chemicals, and land use patterns. So the floods and droughts are controlled by what we know as the El Nino Southern Oscillation. That's what ENSO stands for. And there's a diagram on the right-hand side there, which basically shows you the ocean temperatures being cool, that's blue, that leads to La Nina events. And when it's hot, that leads to the red coloration, that leads to El Nino events. And we associate La Nina with flooding, and we associate El Nino with droughts. And you can look up these events across the century in Australia, and they correlate entirely precisely to the occurrence of droughts and floods across the country. So we know that droughts and floods cause a problem. Why? Well, the issue is inundation. This is a photograph taken around Forbes in late January this year. Unfortunately, Forbes had severe flooding, basically from August, with several sporadic events across that spring and summer. And the landscape was inundated, waterlogged for an extended period of time. I showed you the dung beetle life cycle. Most of that is happening under the ground. So focus on that picture in front of you. If you've got dung beetles under the ground there, they're going to drown. And so the problem is inundation, which leads to drowning. Topography is indeed a beetle's friend. So again, this is from Forbes. More recently, earlier this month in March, I was up there doing some transect data. And you can see Forbes is located in the top right-hand corner of this photograph. The color coding on this diagram is basically showing you the average height above sea level. So you can see the light blues, the aqua tones are around 220, 227 meters above sea level. What you should take away from this is that it's incredibly flat around Forbes, with the exception of this range. I think it was called the Gemelong Ranges, which are slightly southwest of Forbes on the way to West Wyalong. Now, there's 6 sampling points between Forbes and that mountain range. And you can see the mountain range rises up to, what are we talking there, around 350 meters. The first 3 sampling points, starting from Forbes and heading in a southwesterly direction, were not devoid of beetles, but there were very few beetles there. As soon as we hit topography associated with this mountain range, or this ridge line that runs in roughly a north-south direction, beetle numbers increased massively. So I've plotted this out. So what I've plotted here is relative altitude. So I've taken the lowest point in that previous diagram and just called that 0, and then mapped relative altitude above that. So you can see the ranges where I was sampling got up to 50 meters above the plains, the floodplains. Those first 3 points along the bottom of that graph, you can see that in one case, there were no beetles collected. In another case, there was probably 7 or 8 and maybe 10. So very few beetles were collected when that altitude was very low. Why? Because that's the area that flooded. As we go along, and you can see that we got counts of around about 60 beetles. They're all specifically this one beetle, Digitontophagus gazella, pictured on the right-hand side. We got 60 beetles when we were about 50 meters above the floodplain. We got over 100 at another site and close to 145 at the third site. So you can see topography really is the beetle's best friend. Even if you flood, if you've got knolls or rises on your property, then some of those beetles will survive, and they can be used to repopulate the paddocks, the pastures, as you go forward. Unfortunately, we live in a relatively flat country, and vast areas of New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia have actually been inundated across massive areas for an extended period of time, and we've got severe depletion of dung beetle numbers, and they will take, without assistance, decades to recover. So associated with flooding, the flip side is drought, and the issue with drought is the fact that many properties find it necessary to destock. They've got no food and or water. So destocking leads to starvation of the dung beetles. You might have had dung beetles there in the good year, they bred, all those larvae, pupae were under the ground. As they emerge to a landscape, it might be 6 months later, which is devoid of stock, and therefore there's nothing for them to eat, and they'll starve. Generations going forward have got no hope. There is no solution to this apart from restocking dung beetles. We saw this up around Moree, and this where this is here in 2019, where destocking had taken place over an extended period of time, over 18 months, and dung beetles are just starting to go back with the assistance of producers, farming systems groups, land care groups. They're getting back there much quicker. So then we've got, excuse me, then we've got the human input or the human effect, which can change dung beetle diversity and abundance. And that's land use. If you're doing broad scale cropping and there's very few cattle and or sheep in that system, then you'll have very few dung beetles. And we see this in parts of New South Wales where we've been monitoring. we've got broadacre cropping surrounding a cattle property, and there's very few dung beetles on there. So that needs management in order to reintroduce them. And of course, veterinary chemicals. These are the major issue with regards to the abundance and diversity of dung beetles on your property existing at the optimal level and providing you with those ecosystem services that benefit your production systems and leads to greater profit. So what veterinary chemicals are we talking about? This is a graphic which I've borrowed from the bugfarm.uk.co.uk. The website's at the bottom, and it lists a pile of chemicals, and I don't want to go through all these chemicals with you right here. What I basically want to do is just focus on the center section there, where you can see it goes most toxic. Going to the right, there's an arrow which goes to less toxic. And this basically summarizes the issues that we face primarily in Australia, and it's with the group of chemicals. They're endectocides. They're used to treat externally as well as internally. And they're what we call the mectins, or the macrocyclic lactones. Most of the chemicals on this graphic, which go from left at doramectin, ivermectin, eprinomectin, abamectin, I'll skip over SPs to moxidectin, they all fit into this macrocyclic lactone category. Very commonly used since the 1980s. With few exceptions, they are toxic to one or another life stage of the dung beetle. So moxidectin's at the far right, and it's your best bet. If you can use moxidectin at time of peak dung beetle abundance on your property, please do, because that's going to have the least effect on dung beetles going forward. Conversely, doramectin at the other end is going to have the biggest impact on the dung beetles. So that will be up there. Yeah, you can digest that further, but you can see we do have issues with veterinary chemicals used, in this case, for drenching. So do I need to drench? This is the question that we always ask producers. We ask them what their drenching practices are and why they are what they are. And in some cases, it's because that's what they've always done. And what we really encourage people to do, and this slide here is the Parabos website, and it's basically saying do a worm egg count. If you go to the Parabos site, you can click through there, you can find people that can do your worm egg counts for you. And for the small cost of getting your worm egg counts done, you may be able to save yourself large amounts of dollars by not needing to buy the veterinary chemicals, and saving even more dollars because you won't have been impacting the dung beetle population, which are providing ecosystem services and benefiting your production systems. So we're not always saying you don't need to drench. We're just trying to encourage you to ask the question, do I need to drench? And you can tell that by doing your worm egg counts. So let's assume that you do need to drench, and the question then becomes, well, when should I drench? Well, you need to drench when you need to drench. But what I'm trying to get through with this graphic is that dung beetles aren't uniformly abundant across seasons in Australia. So we've got realistically, we've got about 15 to 20 dung beetles, which are introduced species, which are very productive in agricultural systems. We've got probably another dozen native dung beetles, which are adding to that. But you can see here that the top line is a line representing the amount of dung produced by livestock, and it goes up and down, varies slightly with the amount of pasture. The second dotted line beneath that, you can see it gets close to the top line and then it diverges from the top line. And as you move into winter, into spring, you've got a very big service gap. There is a lot of dung which is lying on the pasture, not being processed by beetles because the beetles aren't present. So if you need to drench in October, then you need to drench, and that you should, but ask yourself, what drench should I use? Well, if there's very few beetles around, and you can see that by the service gap, then use a drench which is perhaps more toxic because there's very few beetles that you're going to impact. Conversely, if you're going to drench in February, when there's clearly a lot of beetles around, and this changes for different locations, you really do need to consult with us or someone in order to get the correct information. But in February, when you've got a lot of beetles around, I'd be very nervous about treating them with a toxic drench because you're going to kill a lot of the beetles in your paddock. So use, for example, the moxidectin, which is least toxic to any of the dung beetles that you've got present. I've tried to present this simply. It's far more complex than that, but there are ways to drench and maintain good beetle numbers, both diversity and abundance. So let's assume that you've experienced drought and or flood. We've had both of those in the last 5 years, and you need to restock your pastures. And restocking may be augmentation rather than restocking from zero numbers. But the graphic in front of you associated with that table is trying to get you to focus on what happens if we take the scenario where we've put 1,000 beetles into a paddock. And that is what's represented by that black spot. So you would take 1,000 beetles, a typical number that producers that commercial suppliers of dung beetles sell. You release them in the pasture and they may spread, in this scenario, they spread at 1 kilometre per year. So you can see then there's 6 green circles coming from that central release point. You can see the area that's increasing. So we start out after the year 1 with 314 hectares. And after 6 years, it's going to be a big farm we're on, but after 6 years, we've got to 11,309 hectares. That's the area by increasing 1 kilometre per year from that black dot. You can see the population with a 5-fold increase has started at 1,000 and risen to what seems an impressive 15,625,000 beetles. That seems fantastic. You start with 1,000 and 6 years with a 5-fold increase each year, you've got 15 million. But when you look at the density of beetles, that is how many beetles do you have per hectare, that's only 1,300 beetles per hectare. So we really need to not just count beetles, but we need to know how many beetles you have per hectare, because that is what's going to be providing the ecosystem services. 1,300 beetles per hectare is not enough. So even though you've got 15 million across the landscape, at that density, you're not getting optimal. And this is what Paul referred to before. A lot of producers have dung beetles, 15 million of them, but you may only have a very low density. And so you're not getting the optimal ecosystem services that those beetles are able to provide. So if you do need dung beetles, we're in the position to be able to home in on where you are. The map that you see in front of you, it represents all of the occurrences that have been recorded of dung beetles across the country. There's around about 70,000 dots that occur on that map. Many of them are on top of each other, but we can zoom in on it and we can even home in directly on your property and find out what beetles are in your particular area. That gives us the capacity, coupled with your ability to go out and do flotation and tell us what you're observing, to know what beetles are going to do well in your landscape. And so again, through consultation, we're able to give you the best information that will let you to restock or augment the beetles that you require in your production system. So this image that you see on the screen in front of you is only referring to dung beetles. And so far, that's all I've talked about. I've talked about dung beetles, dung beetles, dung beetles. They're providing fantastic ecosystem services. There's a couple of other beetles. Well, one other beetle, which is Histonomas. It's a predatory species. And what you can see with this image in front of you now is a beetle. It's around 6 to 9 millimeters long. And look at the fangs on it. those fangs out the front are really impressive. And I can recall the first time I ever saw one of these through a hand lens. It's a small beetle, but I thought, whoa, I hope it doesn't bite me. I've inserted some nodule worms, just as an example of a nematode. They could be any nematode out on the right-hand side there. What these beetles do is they live in the dung, and they're voracious feeders on nematode eggs, nematode larvae, and indeed fly larvae. Those impressive jaws go up to the larvae, crunch them, and they suck out the insides, whether that larvae is a nematode or whether that larvae is a maggot. These beetles are doing a very impressive job in the dung as a predatory species. And we encourage you to also look for these and put them onto your system, in your production system. So not a beetle, it's a mite. It's got 8 legs. And you might think, not all mites are good. We immediately think of red-legged earth mite, not great. But these mites that you see on this beetle, these mites belong to a family called Macrocheliddae. They're very small. That beetle is around about 20 millimeters long. So the little pink mites that you see encrusting it all over it are around 1 to 3 millimeters long. And they're what we call phoretic. And that simply means that they're using the dung beetle as a bus service to transport the mite between dung pats. So if you ever go to your dung and you pick up a dung beetle and it's got all of these little mites crawling around on it, we get a lot of questions pertaining to these. Don't panic. They're not a problem. These mites are simply using the dung beetle shuttle service to go between dung pats, and they're also predatory. Even though they're small, the larvae and the eggs of nematodes are smaller, and these often highly abundant mites are feeding on the eggs and indeed the juvenile L1, L2 larval stages of nematodes. So they're great to have around. Again, the inset there is just showing you some threadworm eggs in under a microscope from dung. So we don't make any effort to remove the predatory mites. And when we supply dung beetles, we tell people, don't worry, you're also getting the bonus of predatory mites. So I think that's about time for us. I'll just finish up on this slide, and that's to encourage you to contact us if you do want to know more. If you do want dung beetles, then you can go to inquiries@ecoinsects.com. We do have a website, but we're, as Paul said at the very start of this presentation, we're very new. We're forming as the dung beetle ecosystem engineers finalizes, and Eco Insects will have a web presence. It already has email, it is on Twitter, it's on LinkedIn, and it's got a Facebook presence. So you can find us on social media and be in contact with us. But do contact us if you want to know more about dung beetles, whether that be identification or information as to where to get them from and what's going to work best on your property. We're very keen to engage people who are interested in putting histonomas predatory species as breeding trials on their property. We're working through how to best supply these. And so in the first instance, we'd like to deal with some producers to assist in breeding trials. And then the augmentation and repopulating of landscape after drought and flood, we're looking for the collaborative monitoring and assistance of landcare groups, farming systems groups, which have got the capacity to engage more broadly with the producers in their area. So look, I'll leave it there and encourage questions from the presentation.
Thanks, Russ, and thanks, Paul, for your introduction earlier. You'll be very pleased to know that the questions started thick and fast. So we've got quite a little bank of them already, which is great. So the first one was a comment from Frank saying he's really looking forward to the subject, and he's from Braidwood with a sheep operation. Just move my little...
Been answering a couple of them, so some of them have already jumped into the answered box as well. So
oh, you have too. Thanks, Paul.
Yes.
So Jonathan was a bit interested to know with regards to the suppression of dung beetles in feces relative to drench? And I guess that's another question that I've personally got with regards to how best, if we are drenching our animals, like we've got a whole lot of things to consider. We've got best practice drenching guidelines that we've got to follow, depending on what species we've got, whether we're using a mixture of actives, etc. Are there any other things that we can do if we find ourselves in a situation thinking about how long the product stays in the sheep and will be present in the dung? Is there anything we can do so that we're not just spreading toxic dung all around the place?
Yeah, look, I mean, we've sort of worked with a couple of groups down in the Portland region, so some big sheep producing properties down there, and we're actually looking at the fact that they've got a lot of sheep. They drench. They're necessary to drench. If anyone knows the Portland region, it's rather wet, very good breeding ground for nematodes, but they've got huge populations of dung beetles. And so you'd think on the, what I've just said is that drenches kill dung beetles, but clearly they've got a system down there which is working. And so we're actually looking at how that works. What we do notice is that if you worm a mob of sheep, and if they're sequestered for a couple of days, and there's another mob of sheep which are unwormed, then dung beetles, and this is preliminary, we don't have the hard statistics on it, but it's certainly backed up multiple times. What we observe is that dung beetles, when given a choice of eating dung which is got drench in it and dung which doesn't have drench in it, then they will choose the dung which is drench free. So in terms of best practice, does it tell you drench all your sheep at once? Or can you drench a mob, keep them separate from another, and then subsequently, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, drench the others? The first mob that's been drenched will have had a lot of the nematodes, a lot of the chemical depleting, and then you can drench the next lot. So this is preliminary, and we're not advising this, but we're certainly looking, and we'd like to do further research on this at exactly those sorts of questions.
Okay,
I think that's a good point, Russ. It is complex, and we've had other growers talk about how long does it take for the drench to clear, the body of the sheep, and how long is it still too toxic? Unfortunately, we don't really have the numbers. There isn't the science out there to tell us how long that dung is toxic for. But some of the anecdotal evidence suggests that if your sheep are 24, 48 hours later, the curve is going down rather fast by that point. These drenches aren't designed to last very long periods of time in the animal. So yes, there's a residue, but the residue is dropping quickly. So if you were able to hold them back from going into your best paddocks after that drenching, even for a few days, that might make a difference in terms of the amount of the toxins still coming out of the sheep or the cattle by the time they get out there.
And I guess that would probably flow on to the appropriate use of long-acting and short-acting actives as well. So, if you know that you've got a population of beetles that you need to do some preservation, or that you'd like to preserve, thinking about using some shorter acting. And I noticed that monopantal was on the safer list. That's some of the newer chemistry available as well. So there's obviously some options in there, and whilst we're thinking about, effective, worm control in our place, we've got this IPM bigger picture that makes life a little bit more complex. While we're on this topic, Lisa's asked a question, and her question is, for a particular species, will there be all different stages of eggs, larvae, etc., present at one time? And is there a way some of the beetle population can affect can escape the effect of the drenches?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So let's look at a summer active beetle. They're certainly in Australia, the beetles that we've introduced and those which have established tend to be focused on summer activity. And we've got a let's just take species A. We'll call it dung beetle species A. And it's going to emerge from its winter slumber. And I'm going to suggest to you it comes up in November. And then it will be feeding, because it was going to be hungry. It's going to be feeding voraciously on the dung. And then it's going to breed. And now, depending on what that dung beetle species is, it may breed once. It may breed multiple times. So it really depends on what dung beetle you've got. And Paul mentioned this earlier on. If you've got a dung beetle, and the concept is called volatinism, so I might call something univoltine, which means it breeds once, or multivoltine, which means it breeds multiple times within a season. If you've got a dung beetle which has emerged in November, fed voraciously on contaminated dung, then if it's univoltine and you poisoned the dung, then you've got a problem. The larvae that are going to be evolving or emerging from the hatched eggs are going to be eating poisoned dung. And that's where most of our problem with the mectin drenches and dung beetles occur. It's not so much with the adult beetle, because this may surprise people. Adult beetles don't eat dung. Adult beetles are filter feeders. They haven't got mouth parts that are capable of chewing. So I showed you histonomas and said, look at those fangs, and it goes and bites the nematodes or the maggots, the larvae. But a dung beetle is a filter feeder, and it's slurping out the bacteria and the fungi from the juices of dung. And so there's not many of these mectins, which are not very water soluble, in what the dung beetle is eating. But, and this is the capital B but, the dung, which the dung beetle has transported under the ground, laid its egg in, that egg becomes a larvae. That larvae is eating only the dung that was buried. It's like the caterpillar on your shrub. It's eating the leaf. Well, the dung beetle larvae is eating the solid material, and it's ingesting larger proportions of the mectins. Because it's underground, it's in this subterranean world, it's not being exposed to solar radiation, and sunlight is one of the main ways that mectins out of on pasture break down. So they're not very UV stable, but under the ground, they last a long time. And so the contaminated larvae is eating contaminated dung. Let's imagine that the dung beetle was multivoltine. So it survived the drench because it's filter feeding. It didn't ingest much of it. That first generation of larvae probably had a high mortality. But because it's a multivoltine species, its second or perhaps third generation are fine. So it's a complex answer because it's a complex question. You can impact all stages, but it's most commonly the larval stage.
Thanks, Russ. Gosh, the questions are coming thick and fast, aren't they? Paul, I know Paul's monitoring them as well.
Try to answer a few as we go as well.
Yeah. So I guess we've got some here. So Sandra's asked a quick one about the effect on worm eggs. I also wanted to touch on, while we're talking about drenches, we've talked about the long actings. What about the use of Barbavax? Can you comment on this? Does it have any effects in regards to dung beetles?
Yeah, I'm not aware. Paul, step in here if you do. I'm not aware of any adverse effects from vaccines on dung beetles, but that could be born.
Surprised.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm just going to thank you for that question. What about the worm eggs? I think we might have covered that. Thanks, Sandra, for joining us. So
what was the question on worm eggs?
It's probably the larvae in the dung patch, the dung beetle larvae that are working on the eggs.
So the larvae, dung beetle larvae generally are beneath the surface of the ground, and they're in a brood mass. So they're in a ball. I'll just flick a couple of slides forward here. Oops. If you've still got a screen in front of you, then what you can see here, these have been excavated from under the ground, and the black beetle came out of the big brood mass on the right, the two-tone beetle out of that other brood mass. In there was a larvae which is eating out the dung, and that's all under the ground. So the larvae, by and large, don't interact with the dung on the surface. It's the dung beetle which is interacting with the dung, not the larvae. But are you talking about worm eggs, or are you talking about dung beetle larvae?
We're talking about worm eggs.
Okay, so the worm eggs, which are in the dung, they're the way that they're getting destroyed, whether it's the worm egg, the L1 larvae, or the L2 larvae, which are all in the dung and haven't got no capacity to get out of it. You imagine a dung mass. Just imagine your sheep pellets or your cattle dung. It's dropped onto the paddock. If it's left undisturbed by dung beetles, then it's a fantastic breeding ground for them to grow. However, introduce dung beetles into the equation, and they're digging away in there, feeding on it, and there's competition for this resource amongst all the other dung beetles. And we've seen, 2 kilogram dung masses distributed across an area greater than 1 square meter in a couple of hours by dung beetles. So you've now got a mass of dung, we can all picture a cow pat, which is now spread very thinly across 1 square meter. It's now dry because it's exposed to the sun and it's exposed to the wind. And so any maggots or nematode larvae or eggs that are in there can't survive. They need a warm, moist, humid environment to survive. Now they're exposed to the sun and the desiccating impacts of the wind, and they die.
Thank you. Before we move on from drenches, etc., we've got a couple of questions about the biowormer and whether it has any impact on the dung beetles, or are they in competition? And there's a couple of those questions come through, so we might be able to cover off on those.
Yeah, look, Duddingtonia, I believe it's a fungus. So biowormer, in my understanding of this, is that it's a fungus, and it's a fungus which is specific for nematodes. So as such, it's given to the sheep or the cattle, and it's taking place in the gut. Now, no doubt some of that fungus would be excreted in the dung, but again, it's not going to survive there because it's a fungus which is adapted to living in the gut of the animal. So I can't see a problem with the fungus Duddingtonia impacting dung beetles. I mean, it'd be interesting to see research on that. I haven't seen any, but I haven't heard of any adverse effects.
A couple
Russ,
more.
so could I just jump in there, Megan?
Yeah.
Just in regards to how far beetles go and how their movement, because there's a couple of questions that sort of speak to that. Is populations, how many per hectare, and then if I'm moving cattle around, why don't we talk quickly to that one?
Yeah, okay. So basically this pertains to the concept about beetle density and what's optimal density, I gather.
Yep. Yeah. And then also if I'm moving my cattle, do I have to come back to the same place each year? Is it going to limit my cell grazing, etc.?
Yeah, so let's talk about what's optimal beetle density. I'll phrase this because we saw some densities. I said 1,300 beetles per hectare is not enough. It's not enough to get the optimal ecosystem services. Last year around Wagga at Charles Sturt University of Wagga, we were trapping Buber's bison. It's a big, large, similar to the black beetle on the screen in front of you, around about 2 centimeters long. In a 20-acre paddock, we collected around about 40,000 beetles. So you can work that out based on what the density is per hectare. But 40,000 beetles in 20 acres. And we didn't catch all the beetles. We just cropped that particular paddock. So it does get to the question of what's the optimal density. We know that many thousands of beetles per hectare are required to destroy is probably the wrong word, to displace the dung beneath the surface. So the beetles are taking these brood masses, you can see them on the screen in front of you, which are dung, and they're taking it under the ground. When you've got optimal density, you will see, or in fact, you won't see much, if any, dung on the surface of your paddock. What is that density? Well, it depends. I can tell you that that paddock where we were getting 40,000 Meibusch bison in that 20 acres, it still had dung on the surface. So from that, you could make the observation that even though you have great beetles, you don't have enough. And that's very frequently the case in winter, because we really only have one dung beetle species operating in winter. There's a couple that operate, but their range rarely overlaps. So what's the optimal density? I'm dancing around this question. In excess of 10,000 beetles per hectare. That's what I would be aiming for, but of course it depends on how many stock you've got there, and that depends on the pasture. So it's not a simple answer, but we would aim certainly in most parts of coastal and New South Wales and southern New South Wales and Victoria, South Australia even, we would be looking at 10,000 beetles per hectare. In the rangelands up in Queensland, less, and that's simply because the density of cattle is less. That was in the second question, Paul, and that little second part to the question.
Yeah, just if you're moving your cattle around.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, well, I'll start by saying we advocate rotational grazing. We see much higher abundance and diversity with rotational grazing. How far will a dung beetle travel? Well, most people, when they're rotationally grazing, they're walking their cattle between one paddock and the next. Some of them are putting up a hot wire and simply putting in strip grazing. There's no problems whatsoever with beetles following the flock of sheep or the mob of cattle. If you're going to put them on a truck and take them kilometers away, yeah, you'll run into problems. But beetles will follow the scent of the herd of cattle or the mob of sheep. They will follow the scent, and they can also detect the smell of dung. So they will follow the food source, which they can smell with their antennae. So it's not a problem.
Just a question. There's a couple of people asked a question about drier pellets in the instance of sheep. Mm-hmm. How do we sort of manage that, or are there species which prefer the drier pellets or in drier areas? And I'll group with that one just to comment about alpacas as well. We've got a question about,
I've answered that one already.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, that's okay. So very, very quickly, look, it's true that most of our imported beetles do have a real preference for wet, sloppy dung. A day old, perfect. And even with sheep dung, if they're on good pasture, they do love them soft and moist, because as Russ said, that's what they're actually eating is the fluid. They're slurping the fluid. Charming thought. When you've got dry, hard balls, little pellets, that's not a preference. Some of them will still handle that, and we can certainly work through that on where you are, because it's going to be very regionally specific and timing specific. But increasingly, Russ and I are interested in some of the native species that do actually target those, because, of course, they've been adapted to deal with kangaroo poo. So we're actually looking to try out some of those and move some of those around the country as well, because they may not be in some of the areas. So we'd like to try and see if we can find some solutions. So by all means, contact us, but tell us where you are and the time slots that you know where you're having a problem. And we'll try and come back to you with some options and work it through with you.
So following on from that, I'm going to go back to Portland with our sheep producers down there. When we monitor for beetles, we'll take around about a kilogram of dung, and we'll put it into a mesh bag so the beetles can't actually access it, but they can smell it, and then they fall into a trap underneath. And so from a 1 kilogram packet of dung above a trap, over a 24-hour period, this is sheep dung. So in terms of, are they attracted to sheep dung? So in 24 hours, from a 1 kilogram packet of dung, we got 15,000 beetles. So there was nothing special, and I always have to remind people about that. There was nothing special about that 1 kilogram of sheep dung. So if they all fell into this trap, that's because they were attracted to the sheep dung. Think about your cow pats or all your other dung around the paddock. Nothing special about the dung we used. It's just sourced from the farm. And so, you know, we certainly have fantastic activity on sheep pellets, and they can be dry. You can see them drilled out, and the beetle has gone in and taken all the nutrients out. So this is a bit of a common misconception that dung beetles are for cattle. Yeah, they work brilliantly on cattle dung, and some of them prefer cattle dung, but they work brilliantly on sheep dung. Species do. And as Paul mentioned, there's some Australian native species which have been recognised before to be particularly abundant and active on sheep dung. So we've got solutions for that.
Thanks, Russ.
I'm just doing a quick answer there to someone else's question that's a little bit similar. So they've said that they've got dung beetles, but the dung's drying quickly, and they don't seem to have a lot of activity. I've just suggested have a look at the dung pads carefully. It's one thing that we've noticed is that not all of the dung beetles are shredders where they spread it all out. Some of them, you end up with this, what looks to be a perfectly formed dung pad, but you kick it over and it is just literally a shell.
Yeah,
a
the
really
meringue.
thin little skin. Yeah, it's like a meringue that's been eaten out underneath. So you might have actually had the majority of the dung pad processed. Now, okay, you've missed out on 10% of the dung pad being processed, but it's done most of the job. It's dried it out. It's taken away the opportunity for flies and other larvae to grow underneath there because there's no moisture, there's no dung left, and it's buried 80%. So you're most of the way there. You wouldn't be too worried by that situation. However, it's worth checking, and do the IDs, come back to us. We may have other solutions.
Thanks, Paul. Can we just visit buffalo fly and some of our sort of more northern type issues here? We've got a couple of questions. Genevieve's asked what the effect of porons and ear tags for buffalo fly on dung beetles. And there's another one up here as well. Do all life stages of the dung beetle affect worms and or buffalo fly development? I think I know we talked a little bit about that.
I'll answer the second part. So, do all stages of the dung beetle impact worms? It's the adult dung beetle, while it's processing the dung, which has the impact on the life cycle of your flies and your nematodes, because it's taking a pristine environment for nematodes and larvae to exist in and turning it into a desert. So the adult dung beetle is having the impact on the dung by drying it out, exposing it to the wind and the solar radiation. Now, the first part of that question was, do ear tags and porons, was it? Yep. Do you want to answer that, Paul? Because I know you've been involved.
Yeah, so I've answered one already on that. Is, look, we know that the actives that are in the ear tags, for example, the most common ones, which are SPs and OPs, so synthetic pyrethroids and organophosphates, they are incredibly detrimental and highly toxic on basically all insects. What we don't know is how much is coming out of that tag and either going through the animal or over the animal's skin and ending up in the dung. So we don't know what the dose rates are ending up in the dung or on the ground that could impact the beetles. So we've unfortunately got a really massive knowledge gap, which we're trying to get some work done with MLA to fill some of these gaps in the future. So yeah, look, it is a problem. Probably the one, some of the key takeaway messages that I would be very, very clearly wanting to point out is the tags need to be cut off. That is one thing that we've often had conversations with producers about is if you leave the tags on there forever, of course, the once you've gone past the use by date of the tag, you're now giving a half, a quarter, increasingly smaller doses, you're not only breeding resistance in your buffalo fly, which means that active's no good for you anymore, but you're also increasingly just putting more active out in the environment, which is not a great idea. So I'm sorry we can't give you a clear answer on that. The porons are more likely to have an effect, of course, because you've got purely by volume, you're getting a larger hit, more immediacy, and you're getting a large uptake through the skin. And although some of those actives will end up in the urine, some will end up in the dung as well. Again, not great data out there. If you want to tell us offline which ones you're using, we can follow up and give you the best advice we have. But look, there are some really big gaps here that where research has never been done.
Thank you. A couple of quick ones. Sandra and Baron, they're a couple of Australia's goat gurus. They've joined us today. And Sandra's just said the comments from the Biowormer website for those goat producers and anybody using Biowormer, that there are no negative effects on non-target soil nematodes, earthworms, microarthropods, soil bacteria, and fungi. Beneficial insects feeding or breeding on manure, e.g. dung beetles, fly larvae, are not negatively affected. Baron's just suggested that it's, could there be a study done to see if there's any cohesive or antagonistic activities, but I think by the sounds of things that might have been covered with the what's on the Biowormer website. So thanks, Sandra, for typing that in for us. Really appreciate that. For anybody who's not able to see the answered questions, just click on your Q&A on the little button. If you hover it down at Q&A, you click on that. I've got there's 16 that Paul's been typing away there. I've done a couple. The ones that we're verbally answering, we're not going to be typing the answer to, so they won't show up. If anybody's got to go now, because I'm mindful that we're 10 minutes over time, but I don't want to cut the
we could do
this
all day.
Oh, I know. If anybody does have to go, don't panic. This is all recorded and will be available on our Paraboss website, including the question and answers. So if anybody does have to rush off, don't worry about that.
I might take the next one if you like.
Thanks, Paul.
If we go right down to the bottom, there's one there from Mike. Thank you. What's the average number of larvae produced by dung beetles and how fast will they multiply? So the information that Russ had earlier with those circles is a bit of a rough guide. And as he pointed out in the talk, you've got some species that do multiple generations in a season and some that just do the one. So how well will they breed? Well, it's going to depend on the quality of the dung, because they have to feed their young, and how many of those young actually survive will very much depend on the quality of the dung that's there. So not always in your control. That comes back to a couple of other questions about other species. We know that cattle dung for some of these species is the preference and the best quality, probably because the fermentation that occurs means you've got more bacteria, more protein in that soup for them to have. And a hindgut fermenter, while it might smell great, look great, and attracts the beetles, may not have as much protein in there, may not be breeding the beetles as well. We're not entirely sure, but that's our suspicion at the moment, that's the case. Look, if you had a 5 to 8 times multiplication in the field per year, you're doing really well. We've been able to achieve that at a few places, but we've seen in some cases as high as 10 and 15 times in really good conditions. So it really comes down to, if you're wanting to put dung beetles out there and you want to establish a new species or re-establish a new species, it's a cost-benefit equation, and we'd happily talk you through that. The more you can put out there, the faster they're going to be able to re-establish and get the numbers up. Definitely want to spread them out across the farm so that you have lots of little hubs of breeding going on. But if you can get a few thousand out there, you need a minimum of a few thousand really to establish a population in an area, because you need plenty of them to breed amongst themselves.
Yeah, they have to find each other.
Yeah, they have to find each other. Our real preference is ideally, if there's been a catastrophic event like a bad drought over a period or a flood in a district, we'd prefer to work with, through a land care group or through your local beef improvement group, get together as a group, and it makes it more cost effective for us. We can do more for you, and we can repopulate an area in big chunks, and it is far more likely to succeed. While we're very happy to sell beetles to individual producers, it is a more expensive option and it has a higher risk. So if you can work in groups, just even grabbing a couple of neighbors could make a difference to how successful you are across a landscape. And beetles, funnily enough, don't respect fences. If you do, if you and your neighbors get them, they'll breed amongst themselves. They'll select for the area, which is even better. And over time, you'll have a good population breeding by themselves. Do you want to add to that, Russ? You've been doing a fair bit of this now.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's how long's a piece of string in terms of what's the reproduction rate. I mean, we've heard about reproduction rates with viruses. I think dung beetles are similar. I mean, if you can get a 5-fold increase in the field, that's often wonderful. And that scenario that I gave you before with the increasing area, that's exactly what we're dealing with. So you can start with 1,000 beetles and over 6 years get up to millions of beetles with a 5-fold increase.
There's one here for you, Russ, that is very definitely for you because you've done some very specific work on fire events.
Okay, so FF, do fire events kill off beetle populations? I've just lost it. That's the question. Where has it disappeared to?
Sorry, I'm just deleting them as we go so that we don't have a,
Okay, so I think the question was, does bushfire or fire events, it could be burn-offs, impact beetle populations? Yes and no. So we went down to the south coast of New South Wales after the devastating bushfires there, and we monitored over a 14-month period, starting 1 month after the fires had gone through. 1 month afterwards, the stock had been burned. I mean, it was devastated. It was horrible. And so the stock was not there, fences weren't there, and dung beetles weren't abundant. So the dung beetles, and I'm talking about the beetle, they were sparse on the ground. If we fast forward 14 months, the stock had been bought back, fences had been repaired, and dung beetles in those areas that were fire impacted were the equal of, and sometimes better than, those areas where there were fire hadn't impacted. So our understanding of bushfire is that it's actually a noisy event. And as fire is burning across a pasture, it's causing a lot of noise and a lot of vibration of the ground. And that makes beetles go down the tunnel. So if you drive up to a dung pat and park next to it, don't be surprised if you don't find any dung beetles, because the beetle will interpret the vibration of the car or the vibration of the fire as cattle or sheep, and they don't want to get stomped on. So they go down into the ground. And as such, they're safer to some extent from the fire burning overhead. Now, a lot of beetles obviously died because we didn't catch a lot, but the breeding cycle, the bushfires hit Barrow in the Bega Valley in New Year's Eve, going into the new year. So a lot of the breeding had taken place and there were brood under the ground. So when those brood emerged as adult beetles, well, the fire had long passed. The cattle were back and pasture was back, and they survived and bred well. So fortunately, whilst the fires were devastating, the impact on the beetles in just 12 months, I said 14, but let's just take a year, was minimal. The diversity and abundance was back to where it was. And that wasn't just there. We also did monitoring in Gippsland where the fires were, and across in the Adelaide Hills where the fires were. The same scenario played out across those 3 environments.
I just don't like the water.
Well, no, because they drown because they're encased in a brood mass. Yep.
Yeah. Vicky's got a question which I think is probably a nice little one for us to tackle. if the beetles are following the cattle to a new paddock, do they all go and leave the larval stages and that behind, and the beetles just continue to follow the mob of cattle? Or
Yeah, look,
That's
essentially,
a bit sad, isn't it? They leave all their young behind.
yeah. I mean,
abandoning them.
you do get some beetles which are what you term good parents, and they do brood guarding, but most of the beetles don't, and they in fact just follow the next meal. So, you know, if you've got fresh dung on the ground, those beetles don't follow the herd. They do what they need to do with that dung. They deplete that resource, and then when they need the next meal, they work out where the cattle are or the sheep and fly to them. And remember, these are beetles; they fly.
I'm sure, Paul, you've seen some of those comments with people that are interested in being involved. And
yeah, so I was actually thinking, we talked about this in this startup meeting yesterday, Meg, that I think what we should do here is we've got all the email addresses of everyone that's joined in. I think we'd like to do a follow-up to everybody with like a frequently asked question, couple of pages. We've got lots of questions that sort of cross over. Why don't we send that out to everybody? Give us a day or so to because there's quite a few comments still coming in, but by all means, just flood us with the questions. We'll try and put those into groupings and answer them the best way we can and send them out. Then if there are specific follow-ups, we'll say, look, contact us. But if in doubt, if you contact us on inquiries@ecoinsects.com, we will answer you and we'll come back to you. I can see it's getting flooded now, and it will take a day or so to get through them. But I think the frequently answered questions might be a good way to go to try and check up on all of these ones.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great idea. And what we can also do is I'll just defer the post, like the email, to everybody, so that the frequently asked questions comes out with that. If I can do that, I think I should be able to manage that in the background there. So that should come back in. I'll just defer any of the follow-up emails, the thanks for attending or we missed you. Yeah, I think we might need to, we're 20 minutes over. I think we might need to, are there any other questions that you can see there that you'd really like to answer before we close up?
Yeah, there's one that we always get, and it's from Christine, and she asks what the cost of beetles are. And it's a really hard question to answer because it's like fishing. When the trawler comes in and it's bumper full of fish, the fish are cheap. That's why, you know, fish of the day is always market prices. To a large extent, dung beetles fit into that category as well. I'll sort of answer the question though. Summer species, you can get, for example, in the southern parts of New South Wales down through Victoria and South Australia, Onthophagus taurus and Euonyticellus fulvus, big Latin names, particularly prevalent in summer. And there you can get 4,000 or 5,000 beetles for $1,000. So that works out to be what, 20 cents a beetle. Winter active beetles, for example, in those regions that they're going to be capable of operating in, there's two. There's Onitis caffa, and then there's, as I said, Bubus bison. They are they're harder to get. They're more typically around the $1.25 per beetle. So 1,000 beetles there, setting you back $1,000, $1,250. So it depends on the beetle.
I've commented in here to someone already on that, just saying, we tend to sell a colony. So we're trying to have enough that we know will establish, and that depends a little bit on beetle size as well, of course. But I've commented in there that when we're working through a group, like a land care group, we often do really large collections. So we might try to put out 50,000 in an area. And therefore, the collection for Russ means he can go out and spend a full week going and collecting, and it makes it really cost effective for us. So the price per colony comes down, and we often then also rebate a little bit of money to the land care group to do a bit of monitoring and following up as well. Because ideally we want to leave behind some training and some experience and knowledge to help, because these things are got to be looked after long term. Like we talked about, there will be another drought, there will be another flood. We'd like you guys to all be able to be more resilient to those in the future, which means understanding and having the knowledge yourself and being able to bounce back. And if we can train you up, we'd rather do that so that you're able to work with your neighbours and work in the region to recover from these events as quickly as you can.
Thanks, Russ and Paul, for your time today. And thanks, everybody, for joining in. We've really enjoyed it.
Look, thanks for organising it. It's fantastic.
Yeah.